we're here this afternoon for a session on young people changing democracy. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also the learnings that we can have from First Nations people about democratic practices and how we think about younger generations provoking broader change around the issues that matter to them. I think that's something that will come up across the panel when we talk about that kind of intergenerational engagement in particular. So from harnessing the power of social media to mobilising peers to leading grassroots movements on climate change, healthy relationships and more, young people really are at the forefront of a lot of new ways of doing contemporary democratic practices and discourse. And today we're going to talk about how they're leveraging technology and innovation to create different kinds of inclusive systems, but also the challenges for young people in being heard, getting their issues across, and how they fit into or resist or disrupt politics as usual and the polarised and tumultuous environment more broadly today. So I'm Ariadne Vroman. I'm the, as it says on the screen, the Sir John Bunting Chair of Public Admin here in the Crawford School at ANU. I'm also Deputy Dean Research for the Australian-New Zealand School of Government. Makes me excited to be chairing this panel. I've been thinking about young people in politics since I did my honours thesis in the Dark Ages in 1993. So it's been 30 years of thinking about young people in politics, but I still feel like there's generational changes, things happening, and so much more to learn. So I'm really excited about the panel that I've got with me today. So I'm going to introduce each of the panellists, then I've got a targeted question to each of the panellists, and I've asked them to prepare about 5 minutes in response to that. So they'll each have 5 minutes each. Then I've got a couple of general questions that we might be thinking about right now about particular generational challenges for young people, and then we'll open up into Q&A for the hour. So we'll hopefully have at least 20 minutes of discourse and discussion with the audience as well. So first of all, next to me is Dr. Intifar Chowdhury, who's a youth researcher in the Centre for Social Research and Methods here at ANU. About to move to, is that public? Can I say that? Well, I've just said that. Yeah, okay. All right, the University of Flinders, where she's got a new lecturer level position there as well. Intifar's been writing about better political representation of all young Australians within our democracy. She completed her PhD in political science in the School of Politics and International Relations in the middle of this year. And her doctoral research tackled the question of whether young people are turning away from democracy. And she particularly has large-scale evidence based on survey research to think about what's happening in advanced democracies more broadly. She's also a media commentator, has written pieces for The Conversation, The Guardian, Canberra Times, did a star turn on Q&A, and has written for and has spoken on radio, including Triple J Hack and also the Democracy Sausage podcast. So thank you, Intifar, for coming to talk with us today. So next to Intifar is Professor Nicholas Biddle, who's Associate Director of the Centre for Social Research and Methods here at the ANU. His research interests include the economics and demography of Indigenous populations in Australia and abroad, the patterns and determinants of income inequality, economics of education, in particular early childhood education. And he also researches the application of behavioural economics to public policy and social research methods. He's just released not one but 2 reports this week that I think he'll tell us a little bit about. One about sort of broad satisfaction with democratic institutions, and maybe if we're good, you'll tell us a bit about your volunteering research that he's released this week as well. So really sort of, again, big shifts of how we understand how people's broad attitudes are towards politics. And then here on my left is Chanel Contos, who's the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership Global Youth Committee, and also the founder of the not-for-profit Teach Us Consent. Chanel founded Teach Us Consent, which was built on a campaign that mandated consent education in Australia, and she worked closely with politicians from across the political spectrum, including prime ministers, to do this. Chanel was the recipient of the Australian Human Rights Commission Young People's Medal in 2021, and in 2023 she was named New South Wales Young Woman of the Year for her persistent efforts towards eradicating rape culture. She has a Master's in Education, Gender and International Development from the University College London, and she recently is lucky enough to get to hang out with Julia Gillard at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership based in London as well. And importantly, her book has recently come out called Consent Laid Bare, Sex Entitlement and the Distortion of Desire. So thank you, Chanel. And last but by no means least is Associate Professor Faith Gordon, who is Deputy Associate Dean Research in the ANU College of Law. She's previously held academic position at Queen's University Belfast, University of Westminster and Monash University. She's the Director of the Interdisciplinary International Youth Justice Network, which she established in 2016, and a co-founder and co-moderator of the Australia and New Zealand Society of Criminology's thematic group on children, young people and the criminal justice system. She's an Associate Research Fellow at the Information Law and Policy Centre at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. She's worked extensively on research on youth justice, media representations, children's rights, criminal law, digital technologies, media regulation and climate action. One of the things I'm asking Faith to talk about is particularly her research on young climate activists, but there's lots of other things we can talk about with Faith there as well. All right, now I'm going back to my questions. So very prestigious panel with really broad takes on how we might think about how young people are shaping and changing democracy. But Intefar, my first question is for you. So your recent research has been looking at whether or not young people have turned away from traditional forms of participation and engagement. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what your key findings have been for how we should understand contemporary youth political engagement? And what do you think are the big challenges for existing political institutions?
Sure, thank you so much, Ariadne. So when I started my PhD, I think I was 22, 23, and I didn't like the fact that young people were being stereotyped as not politically, young people are not politically interested. I didn't feel represented in the way young people were being portrayed, not only in the media, but also in academia. So there was a number of papers that came out holding young people culpable for heralding the crisis of democracy. It cut too close to the bone, and I was like, no, that's not true, so I decided to do my PhD on it. So I started with the very basic question of, are young people turning away from democracy? And that made me question the two concepts in the question, young and democracy. Two buzzwords, right? What does it entail being young? And what does it mean? What does democracy mean? So I tried to, and hence I started my research journey with the two concepts, trying to understand. It was a bit of a philosophical journey. What does it mean to be young? So I found out that youth actually has at least three sort of time effects tied to it. You can be young in age, so 18-year-old is younger than a 30-year-old, 30-year-old is younger than a 50-year-old. So that's your age, the biological process of aging. Then you've got the concept of generation. The membership that you have, you're born with. You see, if you're a millennial, once a millennial is always a millennial, unfortunately. Once a baby boomer is always a baby boomer, right?
Plus Gen X, don't forget us.
Yeah,
I know.
And then you've got the period effect, right? So pre-COVID, post-COVID, because the context we find ourselves is also very important. So these three time effects are so highly correlated. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the methods, but you know this, Nick, right? So collinear effects, hard to pass it. And because of that, sometimes the thing that we see in a graph about young people might not be an age effect, might not be a generation effect, or it might just be a period effect. So that's why it's easy to say that young people are turning away from democracy but just charting, you know, what's happening with age. There's more to the story. I'm going to park that for a bit and come to democracy. So democracy, as we largely know, is a system of government where the people who are being ruled have some say in the rules that affect their life, right? Very loosely. And in that broad definition, you already see that young people are probably not as represented as older people, right? You look at the parliament, you look at the average age of people who are representing the constituents, the younger constituents, you don't get to see a lot, right? A lot of younger people. And then, so to run the democracy show, right, you need to have some sort of connection between the citizens and, we all agree, and the democratic sort of the machinery, right? And in my research, I kind of divided it into two platforms that a citizen could engage with democracy, right? So you've got the principles of democracy, the ideals, the idea that sets it apart from all other possible systems of government. And then you've got the processes, right? The way we engage with democracy. So I might like voting, I might not like voting. I might prefer online blog posting. I might prefer writing to the minister, for example. But I don't like voting, for example, for whatever reason. So in my research, what I did is I tried to isolate these 3 time effects, looking at 35 OECD countries, and see which aspect of democracy young people are turning away from. And what I found is that young people are definitely not turning away from the basic principles of democracy. So the allegiance to democracy is quite comparable across generations. But what I see is a significant generational effect when it comes to engagement with democracy. Young people are turning away from democracy, but the traditional processes of democracy, right? And what's happening is that the whole contemporarizing of engaging with the political system. That does not necessarily mean that young people want to engage with political elites. Political elites being one type of actor of the system, right? Now, the growing gap between the distrust or dissatisfaction that we see in advanced democracies in Australia since 1970s, you know, satisfaction with democracy, Nick can talk more about this. Satisfaction with democracy has been declining. 2019 recorded the lowest level of satisfaction. So although young people are tied to the system because of compulsory voting in Australia, what we see is this turn away from anything to do with elite-directed processes. Because we can't really turn away from the ballot box as youth in other countries are being able to do because they have voluntary system, we don't, we have compulsory voting. What's happening is a move away from party politics. So what's taking the place of party politics? Lifestyle politics. So it's called a renaissance in participation. So in the blurb for today's panel, you know, the torch is being handed down in the next generation. I don't think young people want the torch. They're like, no, mate, not your torch. I'll probably use the flashlight in my smartphone. Ain't gonna do that torch anymore. That torch is outdated. But here's the problem. The problem is when young people become so apathetic that they don't want the torch, but they don't have the flashlight as well. So they find themselves in the dark. That's quite poetic, but you get the point, right? So they find themselves in the dark, and that is the problem of disengaging from traditional processes of democracy when there isn't engagement in other forms.
Okay. Great point, Cindy. And we'll come back towards the end of the panel to think about, well, what are the implications of that kind of disconnect? So it's not even a rejection, it's kind of a disconnect between young people's practices and broader institutional practices as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm going to turn to Nick now. So your recent research has been looking at trust and satisfaction with political institutions, both in Australia and the region. Can you give us a bit of a sense of your key findings and also maybe how we should understand young people in comparison to older generations too?
So Inti and I share a corridor in work, and pretty much every time we bump into each other, I have like 50 questions, research questions, which the chat's raised. And I think there's a nice segue from kind of Inti's framing around kind of cohort, age and period effects. So one of the bits of research we've been doing is focusing on kind of the experience of Australians during and leading up to the pandemic and post-pandemic. And if you kind of think about period effects, you don't get more of a kind of a shock than the pandemic. So one of the things we've been looking at is how people's both their experiences and their I guess their attitudes have kind of changed and shifted over the period. And the data, so we've got about 16 or 17 surveys, representative a sample across ages, across geography, so it's pretty robust data. And I guess there's a few points which kind of talk to both the drivers and the outcomes of kind of young people's views towards kind of democracy and society in which they're living. So one is, as you mentioned, we've had a really strong focus on confidence in government and confidence in institutions. And in the kind of the earlier discussion this morning, we did talk about kind of the importance of having that trust and that confidence in institutions. And prior to the pandemic, there wasn't really that big a difference between, in our data, between kind of younger age groups and older age groups. It essentially no one trusted government kind of prior to the pandemic. It was kind of a period of bushfires and pretty poor institutions. And early in the pandemic, confidence in government increased across the population, and that included for young Australians. And so what we saw is quite large increases across the age distribution. But it was only really as the pandemic kind of continued and we kind of moved into the provision of vaccines and immunisation, where we got a real divergence in the experience. And we saw both in terms of views towards government, but also people's kind of own well-being, where we had this real divergence in the experiences between younger Australians, the middle part of the age distribution, and older Australians. So post roughly November, remember in the early part of the period, there was an increase in support for those who are not employed. There was most of the measures were kind of the impact was spread across the age distribution. Beyond kind of the first year of the pandemic, there was this kind of sense that there was a prioritisation of health outcomes for older Australians at the expense of social and other participation and economic participation of younger Australians. And that's kind of it's the same it's the same shock, but it's impacting on age groups very differently. So we saw then that divergence in kind of confidence in institutions across the age distribution. But we also saw that in terms of kind of participation. So Inti talked about kind of two forms of participation. One is kind of standard, where you kind of engage in writing to your local member or kind of very traditional political participation. There's other forms of political participation where younger Australians, younger people in the region are more likely to participate in terms of kind of protest or other forms of kind of non-traditional participation. But volunteering is another form of kind of social participation or participation in institutions. And that's where another example where we saw like a real period effect, a real kind of a differential impact of the pandemic across kind of the age distribution. So early on, everyone dropped in terms of their level of volunteering. But as the pandemic progressed and as we went into the post-pandemic period, essentially older Australians are volunteering at more or less the same rate as they were pre-pandemic, whereas those under the age of 35, there's still a large gap in kind of volunteering rates between pre and post-pandemic. And to me, that's not a kind of a signal of disengagement. It's a signal of the way in which the pandemic has had a very different kind of effect. Where if you think about the ways in which people volunteer, and volunteering does have benefits to the community, but also to the individual, it's through kind of social networks, it's through kind of interaction. You meet people, you learn about opportunities, you find ways where you can help and contribute. If you have a couple of years where that kind of interaction, that ability to kind of build those networks disappears, then it's much harder to find those opportunities. So I think there's another kind of period effect which could potentially, I mean, Inti's successor, when she's supervising a PhD student in about 15, 20 years, looking at period effects back 15 and 20 years ago, we'll kind of be able to see whether these kind of shocks have continued to kind of play out and make it harder for people of that kind of cohort to continue with that participation. But finally, on the kind of question of attitudes, I think Inti's right. There has been no kind of movement away from democracy in any of the data, either when we look within Australia or when we look across countries within our regions. If you think about populism, we've got dozens of measures of populism on our surveys, and younger Australians are more likely and sometimes less likely to support aspects of populism and aspects of kind of anti-democratic kind of views. So I think there's kind of some Inti's right to kind of challenge and kind of think and try and get underneath some of these assumptions. But I do think that the way in which the government or society has responded to things which are impacting on you, that's what's likely to be driving those differences.
Yeah, no, great. I think it's really important for us to be thinking about the context and the pandemic context, and I guess the long tail effects, particularly on young people's mental health, but also their access to sort of social and economic supports as well as shaping their engagement or even shaping their expectations of institutions, which both of you are bringing up. So in some ways, when we talk now with Chanel about the work that she's been doing and I guess the social movement you more or less started during the pandemic and predominantly online. So in some ways you were enabled by what was happening at that time to be able to draw attention to a really key issue in public debate. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your book and your advocacy, but also tell us a bit about what's happening next in terms of consent education more broadly. And I threw in there maybe other forms of regulation you've been calling for other parts of young people's social existence, like dating apps and so on as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so just also to go wind back all the way to the beginning when Teachers' Consent movement started, I essentially posted a poll on Instagram. The intention at the time, I wasn't thinking about democracy in the sense of a political space. I was thinking about it more in terms of old students trying to have a say to the old school they went to change things for new students. So it was like a form of democracy, but not in, I guess, the way that it's being framed right now. And I asked, has anyone close to you ever been sexually assaulted by someone who went to an all-boys school in Sydney? It was up for 24 hours. 203 people said yes. I'm trying to cut a long story short. Ended up launching a website where over 7,000 Australians posted their testimony of sexual assault, and almost 50,000 Australians signed this petition for mandated holistic consent education in the Australian curriculum. And something I just want to kind of like pick up on what you both touched on is like these ideas of the way young people engage in the democratic process. The way I kind of thought of it on reflection was the traditional structures around democracy are very inaccessible. They're predominantly old, they're predominantly white, they're literally, Parliament House a few kilometres down the road. There's an eliteness to that. And I think what's changed with the tools that young people have access to today is we can engage in the democratic process in such a simple way, i.e. signing a petition, whether we're conscious of it or not. And I think because of this emergence of social media, because of, even things like popularism, all of this sort of stuff, we've shifted the dial to this kind of like new form of power structure where only a really small amount of input can have a really large impact if kind of like all peers are doing it at the same time. So it may have taken someone 5 seconds to sign that petition, and then a year later there's been a like mammoth policy change in the Australian curriculum. And I think what's really exciting about this new form of power that young people tend to employ, different to, voting that only comes around once every, couple of years or whatever, is it's very transparent, it's widely accessible. It means that you can lend yourself to multiple kind of social movements versus before when if you're going to dedicate your time to changing some sort of democratic process and you had to, be in Parliament House lobbying for something or writing to MPs and spending time doing those emails, it just takes just logistically time. And I do also think the way that young people define leadership is changing so that intersectionality and diversity and inclusion are being put at the forefront of that as we do engage in this new power. So what happened from that petition was mandated consent education in the Australian curriculum, which is really exciting and just really cool that, I meet people all the time who say, like, I signed that petition, I posted a testimony, and it's like, well, you did this. Like, no one would have cared if I just said anything. It's the fact that 7,000 people did it once.
Yeah. No, it's a really important example of both the peer-to-peer discussion, but also the power of personal stories to create change as well and to build that momentum.
Which another thing I think that maybe this is again a period thing, there's been a lot less, I guess, shame and taboo around this topic, particularly in terms of sexual violence. So the power to those sort of stories coming from an individual perspective, I think, has broken a lot of stigmas and really hit home with a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I can understand that, but it's still, I guess, a big road for a lot more
yes, obviously.
society as well. Before I go to Faith, so what are you working on now in this area still, or?
Yes, very much still in this area. So I kind of have 3 things going on. So I just wrote my book, Consent Laid Bare, if anyone's interested in reading about patriarchy and rape culture and all of those fun things. And I work at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, where I'm chairing their Global Youth Committee, which is an incredible privilege because I guess the idea is trying to bridge this massive disconnect between young people and policymakers. So the Global Institute does incredible research. It's very neoliberal in focus by default of the way it was started, and the fact it sits within the ANU, it's obviously going to be in part an exclusive institution and quite a white institution and things like that. So it's how can we break down those barriers? How can we incorporate the voice of young people, incorporate diverse voices from the very beginning in the policy research and advocacy we do, and then also kind of in turn empower them and kind of give them level up in the work that they do with our support. And then the third thing is Teach Us Consent. So the campaign turned into a non-for-profit, which now has received $3.5 million in government funding, which we will hopefully get next year. Tess is here from Teach Us Consent. She's our first employee. And we're going to be a fully youth-led organisation. Everyone on the board is under 35, and youth voices are embedded in it from the very beginning. So really excited to do that project.
Yeah, so the point is young people setting up the institutions for themselves that give them voice.
Yes.
And I guess that critical mass capacity as well. Thank you, Chanel. And we'll come back to some of these issues too about how we then translate what young people are doing into more formal political institutions. So Faith, some of your recent research has been looking at young climate activists, and this is, I guess, another field again where we've seen, Greta Thunberg has sort of been leading a particular movement, but really questioning the traditional status quo ways of thinking and doing politics. So young climate activists using different kind of mechanisms. So can you tell us a bit about your findings from that research and where you think those movements are heading as well?
Sure, thanks. So this project that I'm on is quite a large-scale project with a huge team. So I'd like to acknowledge all the work everyone's doing on the project. So my kind of stream of research in that is about how children and young people use technology, social media platforms and different forms of media to mobilise, to get the message out, to challenge. And that's an area actually that I've been working on for quite a while since formulated part of my PhD years ago. So I'm interested in this area and have been for quite a long time, as well as how more mainstream, so our mainstream media portray and represent young people. So both how they use their own forms of media and also how the mainstream portray and represent.
Sorry, that was me, I
Or
think.
was it? Okay,
Sorry.
no worries. I thought it was me. I was like,
Can I also just jump in there really quickly? It's funny that you say that because something that I find really humorous is I'm consistently referred to in the media as a former schoolgirl when I literally have a master's degree in gender and education, but I'm a former schoolgirl,
so
which
that's
I don't think would
really
ever
well.
happen for a boy either. Yeah, sorry, keep going, but I just thought relevant.
And this is, you know,
Yeah.
that's a really live example of the labels and kind of
Diminishing.
of how the mainstream media choose to kind of refer to you. So, in this research, it's had an interesting journey as a project because we applied and you throw a lot of time and effort into the application processes, and we got vetoed by it was recommended for funding, but the previous government, one of the ministers, said that the project wasn't in the national interest. And the message that sent out really was that, you know, young people, you know, them challenging what was going on in the mainstream and wanting, you know, action and also better education in relation to climate change was deemed not in the public interest. So we're really pleased that the project got funded the next time around. I suppose there are many ways in which, and this research is ongoing, so these are only really initial findings, but there are many ways in which children and young people are, you know, creating change. And what I'd say is that, you know, firstly, their use of, you know, various different platforms, different forms of media. We saw that really come through quite clearly during COVID. So, for example, the School Strikes for Climate movement, who, you know, did meet in person. You'll all have probably seen, or maybe young people in your circle, belonging to your circle, were involved. But you know, they came together and you know, created banners and posters and imagery, and they used social media platforms to mobilise those in-person marches and those traditional forms really of protest. But then COVID happened. So what we have been tracking is, you know, how young people in that movement in particular really, you know, dealt with the fact that we had lockdowns and we couldn't meet in person. So what we've been seeing is huge use of online and different forms of media. So that's one sort of area that we're looking at in the study. Also, you know, some of my colleagues are looking at the speeches, so the really powerful speeches that young people have made, you know, at these gatherings, and also, you know, how that's been shared and referred to by other young people on social media, but also how the mainstream media have or have not reported on those speeches made by young people. And there's certainly, just linking back to your point, a gender dynamic as we're finding to that. And also an aspect that I'm particularly interested in is, you know, the reports by particularly young leaders about the negative harassment, abuse, you know, racial abuse that, you know, a number of young people have had to deal with because they have, you know, been involved in strategic litigation against the government or have been a key prominent leader in mobilising young people to be involved in climate action. So that's an area that, you know, I'm really interested in as well. And we have seen young people, you know, really lead the way in relation to taking action against the government using those tools of the legal process through strategic litigation, and there's been some really high-profile cases, some disappointing outcomes and some wins in that space as well. And also the fact that that's become part of a broader network globally of young people. And we're seeing, you know, groups of Indigenous children and young people leading the way also in taking, you know, action and using the law in that way, and also linking up with other groups of Indigenous children and young people elsewhere too. So those are some of the areas that we're really doing a deep dive. It's all very, you know, early stages, but a lot of really interesting findings so far. And I think it really highlights as well too that, you know, young people are using the technology, as you mentioned, really in harnessing that. You know, when the older traditional forms aren't working for them, or they're not included in, or they're receiving very negative. You know, as we saw, School Strikes for Climate, you know, received you know, a lot of negative responses from the former Prime Minister, for example. So the kind of reactions and responses directed towards them is really a big signal, I think, too, in relation to how we're viewing young people involved in these.
Definitely, those points are really important, Faith. So we have this sense that young people are, you know, driven by issues that matter to them in their lives. They're using peer-to-peer networks and mechanisms and the tools, you know, technological tools that can amplify their messages and help them organise. We get a sense that they're not feeling that they're being heard by traditional institutions, so they're not really even looking towards them. But we also get this sense that young people are going through a very particular period of time. I mean, I was also interested in this thinking. I'm going to skip because I want to move to question time, but one of the issues I thought was, I mean, young people aren't all the same. I think the intersectional message is really important, but also the diversity of lived experience among young people. You know, a lot of young people are facing significant financial insecurity, their sort of future life at work and access to housing, and all of these things are more precarious for some young people than previous generations, and we're kind of seeing that, again, those differences are quite vast. So I think this is important that we don't homogenise young people, that there are these differences, different issues matter to different young people, but what's often common is the kind of tools that they're using and the social networks that they're in as well. So I'm going to, the last question I want to ask before I turn to the audience is, so how do we actually get institutions to engage and listen to young people on young people's terms? You know, where do you think the sort of possibilities are for creating that space to happen? What do you go first? Yeah,
well, it's actually interesting because last week I hosted a roundtable with the Global Institute Women's Leadership's Global Youth Committee, mouthful, sorry, and the Sexual Family Domestic Violence Commissioner, Michaela Cronin, and the purpose of it was to understand how, through the work that she does, they could better embed the voices and needs and wants of young people. And one of a big takeaway out of it was that you need to meet young people where they are, because if you're trying to kind of call young people to those old systems of power, for example, that roundtable, to be self-critical, was created from a group of people who are extremely passionate, who applied to be on the youth committee, who got into the youth committee and then ended up in that room. But they also then don't represent the standard Australian youth who may not be engaged in that sort of way. And even just the setting in itself, formal room, round table, commissioner, scary, whatever, much more, casual people who maybe a lot of young people don't feel confident public speaking yet, especially in front of older people, things like that. How can you meet them where they're at and let them know that you want to hear their voice by going into their spaces and their orbits and the way that they kind of show democracy and leadership and all these sort of things.
Yeah, great. Does anyone else want to have a go on?
Just adding to that, and that's a fantastic point, younger people are digital natives, so contemporizing older types of engagement, so be it voting, why can't we do online voting? For example, radical. This is radical. I know there are hoops to go through. Would we need another referendum for that? No, right?
Don't think so, no.
Electoral Act change does not need a referendum. Anyways, the other thing is leadership, I think.
Yeah.
And David Pocket was here earlier today, and he's 30-something, I would assume. And having like younger representatives, and diverse younger representatives, I think is a good way of bringing young people in traditional forms of politics. At the moment, I think we have a few, right? I mean, Parliament is not even safe for women. I mean, we couldn't even achieve that, so I think it's a long shot. But I think in our generation, and probably you would agree, is there is an aversion towards political career in public office, especially among women. So there was a time I used to aspire to be a politician, and my friends would be like, "Ew, what's wrong with you?" I'm like, "Okay, fine, I'll probably just be an academic then." But you know, I think there's a problem there.
Yeah.
Like that aversion from political leadership, that bad politicians, cruel politicians, or mean people, there's a problem there. And I think that needs to change by more younger people sticking out their hands to be in political leadership.
Yeah, okay. So it needs to be kind of a cultural and leadership change as well to make it more appealing.
Because just one thing is, I think you kind of touched on this, but it's worth highlighting. It's very hard to engage in kind of political discussion, however you want to frame it, if you are worrying about how you're going to pay for rent, if you're worrying about if you have to work while you're work long hours while you're studying, or if you're feeling under financial stress. It's not just the time, it's kind of the cognitive freedom which you get from feeling kind of safe and comfortable in your financial situation. So I think, just really simply, one way to make it easier for any generation really to engage is to have that freedom, to have that financial position, which some people have, but many people don't.
Yeah, okay. So it goes back to the first panellist today, which is to kind of marry together political equality and social and economic equality as sort of as broader goals as well. Okay. I think we've got about, well, see, I'm timed up. Oh, yeah, quickly,
one
and then
little
we've
point
got,
on that. So for my PhD, I interviewed a lot of politicians about their interactions with young people, and resoundingly there was this response of, well, they don't vote, so they're not really my target audience here.
Yeah, wow.
So I think we really, obviously lowering the voting age has been, has come up again, and I'm really interested in that debate. And I think that, those attitudes from politics, not everyone is like, David, for example, who will come in and interact. So I think the attitudes, and it also goes to the core, I guess, of, more broadly, adults' attitudes towards young people in our society as well. So I just wanted to throw that in the discussion.
That's it, yeah, it's a great point. All right, over to you. Do people have some questions or some comments? Okay, Emily?
Thank you. That's brilliant and got me sparking and thinking. I'm Emily from Democracy Co. And I work in deliberative democracy. So often we are trying to get more young people in the room. And I wanted to test this. I don't know if it's right or not, so I thought I'd just, use you guys to test it. Our best practice thinking is that engaging with young people separately doesn't shift the dial. And so what we try to do is to bring them in to spaces where there are older, more set in their view kind of people. What we find is that young people are real bridge builders. They help to find innovation and stretch thinking, and whatnot. But I'm not quite sure if that's what we should keep doing, because I feel like sometimes we try not to have them outnumbered, but just sometimes they are. And, you know, I just sometimes wonder, how do we find that balance between having, you know, having everyone benefit from the views of young people, while also authentically listening to young people? Does that make sense? It's probably not a very clear question.
I mean, I think I think it's actually really nice to integrate them in situations, because I think that also increases the capabilities of young people to feel comfortable in other situations like that. And then, exactly as you said, people hear from them who maybe wouldn't traditionally, whereas if you consult with young people separately, it's probably going to be someone who's gone out of their way to consult with young people to hear from them, who probably doesn't necessarily need to hear the message that young people's voices are important. So yeah, I think integrating is fine. I understand the balance between if there's like a you know, minority representation and it feels kind of obvious, sometimes that can be uncomfortable in spaces and you don't want to put the onus on them to represent a whole group of young people. But I think that I think it's definitely better than nothing.
So I might add, so we don't do deliberative democracy, but we do a lot of data collection, and that includes kind of surveys, but also kind of qualitative data collection. And I think kind of the ways in which kind of focus groups as a form of data collection can work has, I guess, some kind of analogies to deliberative democracy. And I think kind of focus groups tend to work better when you do have that diversity of views, but you need to have some shared, something shared as well. It might not be kind of generation, it might not be age, but some kind of hook, something to link people. So I think it might not be that it might need to have something else which of a shared interest, and then that shared interest kind of creates those discussions. At least it does with data collection, and my assumption is in a deliberative democracy sense it could have the same kind of impact.
Thanks for the conversation. I'm Thea from the Centre for Public Impact. So when you were talking, Intifa, about sort of democracy at the beginning, you spoke about democratic principles and ideals versus the sort of traditional processes. What I'd love to hear about is sort of democratic innovations that you've observed. So like some that I know about are, I know that in Taiwan, they use youth mentors. So that's Audrey Tang, who's a minister over there, has introduced this concept of youth mentors. So every minister has a youth mentor. It's like reverse mentorship, right? And, you know, in Wales, they've introduced the Commissioner for Future Generations, which really starts to centre the voices of even people who haven't been born yet in conversations around policy design. I'd love to know whether you've sort of come across, you know, other interesting forms of innovation that I guess engage young people and also address that issue that you mentioned, Faith, around sort of politicians saying, well, they don't vote, so they don't really matter.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I can exactly answer your question, but I'll try, right? Some methods that are, I don't research on that area of democratic innovation, but I can give you some anecdotal, some creative stuff that my peers tend to do, who tend to be quite politically engaged though. So I would be quite cautious in saying that they represent the wider young youth, Australian youth. I have a friend who does graffiti and political, you know, expression of their political stance by doing graffiti. I have another friend who does, you know, those stickers that you can put behind your, like on your computers. So those kind of stickers. Veganism, some would say, it's a bit tricky to talk about that if you're not completely across the field, but political veganism and taking a stance while, you know, animal protection and then nature protection. So within my peers, I've got more people who are engaging with, who are doing politics, and Chanel kind of touched on it, without necessarily consciously saying that, hey, I'm doing politics. It's like, it's more a lifestyle kind of politics, which is directed by their needs, the needs of their lives, rather than what a political party is saying. So the absence of partisan cues is I tend to see more within my friend circles. So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but these are sort of creative, innovative ways of engaging with politics.
So do you have any examples, or from the youth justice field, or from any that come to mind for you?
I was just going to make the point that sort of the more traditional forms of politics, you know, being a local councillor and a local representative, like, I guess political parties are going to have to ask themselves, some of them, you know, a question about the future, because if you don't have a grassroots movement that is populated by a lot of young people, what's the future of your party, your political party? So, and that's something I kind of became interested in. I'm from Northern Ireland, and our local assembly has not been running for 2 years now, and I just want to see some, you know, young people with a lot of energy come in and sort of talk sense to people. But I think it's a big question for political parties because, you know, membership's falling, we know statistically around the world. So it's a big question for democracy, I think, at large. On your point about sort of, you know, consulting with children and young people, I mainly, you know, do work with children and young people in organisations, you know, kids in care, kids with justice involvement and experience. And, you know, often young people will say, you know, they've kind of got consultation fatigue, some of those young people. But also, what are you doing with what I'm telling you? Because this is kind of a painful journey to relay this experience to you, but what are you doing with it? So I think we have a personal responsibility when we consult with young people, at the very least, to tell them what we find or you know, what their voices collectively have told us, but also do something with it. Because we can consult and produce report and report, but unless there's actually some sort of action, and, you know, quite clearly you got action with yours, which is great, and we have like a foundational change to point to. And I think that can, and I have in my own research had, you know, not on a grand scale, but something quite similar where, you know, young people felt a sense of ownership, they reported back, because, you know, they felt that they were a cog in the wheel to get that change. So I think as organisations, it's not always possible to get things over the line, but at least to show that their voices got to people and someone listened, I think is so important.
Yeah, no, those feedback loops built in from the beginning are really important. Otherwise, you're breeding scepticism and fatigue.
Can I add one tiny thing to that?
Yep.
Something also that I think I just realised, like, we haven't addressed on the whole panel that is massive, is most forms of art are political commentary in different ways with kind of like no consciousness, whether that's song, like music, paintings, like all these sort of things. And it's almost a contradiction to call that a form of innovative, like democracy, was that the phrase you used? Because it's almost as if they're not even like trying to think about that. It's just like normal human expression to have opinions and want things to change and things to do better. But has anyone ever heard of Spinifex Gum? I saw them perform their Indigenous youth choir, for anyone who doesn't know about them. And I saw them perform the other week, and it was the most incredible form of political activism and commentary in an expression of art. Walking into that room, having absolutely no idea that was what was going to happen, and coming out of it being like, oh my God, if every single Australian saw that, we would probably have a treaty in like 2 weeks. And I think, that's a really powerful example of like young people that we don't even clock as them being innovative. It's just, behaviour.
That's great. Spinifex Gum.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you
We'll
ever
be checking
get the
them out,
chance to see them.
And seeing them
Like,
live sounds like it's
Literally
really
the
important.
most incredible thing I've ever seen,
Great. Carolyn?
Hi, I'm Carolyn Hendricks. I'm from the Crawford School here. I just had a question that's really about sort of bridge builders, and I guess the context is, I guess, that there's a danger in sort of othering the youth or the youth othering older people and sort of a binary setting up. And I wanted to ask the panel if they had any examples where there was some recognition that there were some allies out there. So most of us have young people in our lives or have people that we relate to as young. And we want in my case, kids to be politically active and to take an interest in the world, etc. And, but that's my assumption that they would want that advice from me as a parent. So the question, I guess, for some of the members of the panel is, do you think there is this sort of sense that there are allies out there in other generations that would want to work with them to help them to have greater voice, or that there is a desire to actually take their own journey and not to have interference? So it's a sort of question about how much autonomy and agency do younger people want in political participation? Because I do think there's a lot of allies in institutions and in, family circles that want young people to feel empowered.
Can we make a point on that? So in the climate action space, we've seen intergenerational relationships really come into the fore. The lead applicant, Anjali Sharma, who's a law student here at ANU, the nun who was she was required for that legal case to go forward because that group of children couldn't due to their age. So we've seen a lot of intergenerational relationships and partnership coming to the fore. And I think children should be able to on their own take that case. But anyway, it's one example of partnership through the generations. And I don't think we can make sort of assumptions about how young people view adults either, too. But I think a lot of it's probably down to our approaches and also respecting what they're saying and doing and not talking over them and letting them do, but supporting in ways that we can from the sidelines, I think, is key. But we've seen the intergenerational relationships in the climate change, strategic litigation space for sure in Australia.
Just to add to that, and I wouldn't be answering the question, but just like a comment to that is who the young person is. I mean, in your question, I think you're talking about young in age versus someone who's older and the relationship there. And Faith's comment is absolutely right. There has to be respect both ways while communicating. But there's also the generation bit where, like, the oldest millennial is 43, and you've got the youngest who's 28, right? So, I mean, each generation has its generational idiosyncrasies, values, the way millennials approach politics or life in general, right, is quite different. And with younger generations, what we see is the transition to adulthood has been protracted. So the time that my parents took to become full adults, I'm probably taking longer to gain all those markers of adulthood. Home ownership is completely out of the way, right? That's not happening. But, getting married, just some examples, right? Or getting a stable job and things like that, it takes longer. My parents probably did it by the time they were 25. I'll probably get one or two of those things by the time I'm 35. So I think that nuance is also quite important while dealing with generations and newer generation. And Gen Z is completely, it's a different story. The COVID generation, the experiences are quite different from previous generations. I think those nuances are also quite important to be acknowledged, so that I think acknowledging them and then handling them as needed is quite important.
Yeah, okay, I am going to finish things up because I know we're over time and there's another plenary. But I think there are lots of things that we've heard today, but one of the things that came up earlier today that I think is coming out here is building our capacity to empathise and listen to people who have fundamentally different experiences from us, and not necessarily imposing our own experiences as well, and then how that possibly builds forms of collective action and also broader social change. So empathy. And I'll make a recommendation. There's a really great all-women punk band from London called Dreamwife, who have a song that they talk about empathy a lot in that song. But anyway, there you go. But Spinifex Gum, otherwise. So
Yeah, both of them.
it's you know Dreamwife.
No.
Oh,
I said I'll listen to. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I thought they were friends. Right, okay. They are
You
very
too.
Okay. Join me in thanking the panel. Great work, guys.